August 18th, 1944, Chartres, France. The streets are filled with celebration. Church bells ring, flags wave. Liberation has finally come. But in the center of the crowd, a young woman walks in silence. Her head has been shaved. Her eyes stare at the ground. In her arms, she holds a baby, barely a year old. The crowd screams at her. They spit. They laugh. They point. Her name is Simone Touseau. She is 23 years old. She was not a traitor. She was not a spy. She never gave secrets to the enemy. She never betrayed her country. But she loved the wrong man. And for that, she would be punished in front of the world. The photograph that captured this moment was taken by Robert Capa, one of the most famous war photographers in history. His lens had witnessed D-Day, the Spanish Civil War, the fall of dictators and the rise of heroes. But this image, this quiet, devastating image of a mother holding her child while her dignity is stripped away, would become one of his most powerful works, because it showed something the history books rarely talk about. It showed what happens after liberation. It showed the violence that hides behind victory. It showed how a nation, desperate to heal, turned on its own people and called it justice. This is the story of Simone Touseau. But it is also the story of 20,000 women like her. Women who were punished without trial. Women who were shamed in public squares. Women whose lives were destroyed, not by the enemy, but by their own neighbors. History remembers wars, but it often forgets the pain that hides behind the cheering crowds. Asterisk, to understand what happened to Simone, we must first go back to June 1940. France has fallen. In just 6 weeks, the German army swept through the country like a storm. The government collapsed. The military surrendered. And suddenly, overnight, France was no longer free. The Nazis occupied the northern half of the country, including Paris. The southern half became the Vichy regime, a puppet government that collaborated with Germany. French citizens woke up one morning to find German soldiers on their streets, in their cafes, walking past their homes. For 4 years, this would be their reality. Now imagine you are a young woman living in occupied France. You are 20 years old. Maybe you work in a shop. Maybe you help your family on a farm. Maybe you're a teacher, a seamstress, a secretary. You are trying to survive. And survival in occupied France was not simple. There were food shortages, ration cards, curfews, constant fear. The Gestapo could arrest you at any moment. Resistance fighters were being shot in the streets. Jewish neighbors were disappearing in the night. Every day was uncertain, and into this world came the occupiers. German soldiers. Some were brutal, some were indifferent, and some were human. They shopped in the same markets. They drank in the same cafes. They smiled. They spoke broken French. Some tried to be kind. Some brought chocolate for children. Some helped carry heavy bags for elderly women. And yes, some fell in love. This is the uncomfortable truth that history struggles to hold. Not every German soldier was a monster. Not every interaction was violent. And not every relationship was forced. Simone Touseau met a German soldier whose name we still do not know. We don't know how they met. We don't know what he looked like. We don't know if he was kind or cruel or somewhere in between. What we know is this: they had a relationship. And from that relationship, Simone became pregnant. In 1943, she gave birth to a daughter. By the standards of occupied France, this made her a collaborator, a traitor, a woman who had slept with the enemy. But by the standards of human experience, she was simply a woman who had fallen in love in the worst possible time. Asterisk, the word collaboration carries weight. It suggests betrayal. It suggests choice. It suggests guilt. But collaboration during the occupation was not black and white. At the top, there were real traitors. French officials who helped the Nazis, police officers who rounded up Jewish families, business owners who profited from the war, informants who sent resistance fighters to their deaths. These people made deliberate choices to aid the enemy. They gained power, they gained money, they gained safety while their neighbors suffered. But below them, there were millions of ordinary people just trying to survive. A baker who sold bread to German soldiers, was he a collaborator? A shopkeeper who served them in her store, was she guilty? A farmer who sold vegetables to the occupation forces because he had no other customers, was he a traitor? And what about the women? Some women did collaborate in serious ways. There were French women who worked as informants, women who spied for the Gestapo, women who betrayed resistance fighters and caused deaths. But the vast majority of women accused after the war were guilty of only one thing: having a relationship with a German soldier. No espionage, no betrayal of secrets, no violence, just love, or loneliness, or survival. Some relationships were genuine. Some were transactional women who traded companionship for food, for safety, for protection. Some were forced. Some began as one thing and became another. But when liberation came, none of these details mattered. The women were all treated the same. Summer 1944. The Allies have landed in Normandy. The German army is retreating. Town by town, village by village, France is being liberated. And as the German soldiers flee, something else begins. The reckoning. On every newly freed town, the same scene plays out. Crowds gather in the square. Names are shouted. Women are dragged from their homes. Some are pulled from their beds. Some are found hiding in basements, in attics, in churches. They are brought to the center of town. And there, in front of everyone, their heads are shaved. This was called tonti, the shaving. It was meant to mark them, to shame them, to make them visible. The crowds would cheer. Children would watch. Photographers would capture the moment. And the women, terrified, humiliated, crying, would stand there as their hair fell to the ground. Some were stripped naked. Some were beaten. Some had swastikas painted on their foreheads or their chests. Some were paraded through the streets like animals. And some, like Simone, held their children while it happened. Robert Capa arrived in Chartres on August 18, 1944, just as the town was being liberated. He had followed the Allied troops through France, documenting the war. But when he saw what was happening in the town square, he raised his camera. He photographed Simone as she walked through the crowd. Her hair was gone. Her face was blank. Her baby daughter clung to her chest. Behind her, people laughed and pointed. Capa later said that this was one of the most difficult photographs he ever took, because it wasn't a photograph of war. It was a photograph of cruelty committed by people who had just been freed. Simone's crime, according to the crowd, was clear. She had a child with a German soldier. Therefore, she was guilty. No trial, no evidence, no questions asked. Her punishment was decided by the mob. Simone Touseau was not alone across France. As liberation swept through the country, an estimated 20,000 women were subjected to public humiliation. Their heads were shaved. Their bodies were marked. Their names were destroyed. Some historians believe the real number is even higher, perhaps 30,000 or more, because many cases were never recorded. Many happened in small villages where no photographer was present. Many women were too ashamed to ever speak of it. In Paris, hundreds of women were shaved in the streets during the liberation celebrations in August 1944. In Lyon, women were paraded naked through the town square. In Marseille, women were beaten and their homes were burned. This was not justice. This was revenge. And the cruelty did not stop with the shaving. Some women were imprisoned without trial. Some were sent to internment camps. Some were forced into labor. Some were separated from their children, and some were killed in certain towns. Women accused of collaboration were executed by firing squad or worse, by lynch mobs who took justice into their own hands. One woman in Normandy was thrown down a well. Another was dragged behind a car through the streets. Another was burned alive in her home. These were not isolated incidents. This was a wave of violence that swept across France, carried out not by the Nazis, but by French citizens against their own people. And the targets were almost always women. Here is the question that haunts this story. Why were women targeted? French men also collaborated. Some worked for the Vichy government. Some served in pro-Nazi militias. Some informed on their neighbors. Some profited from the occupation. But when liberation came, these men were often treated differently. Some were arrested and given trials. Some were sentenced to prison. Some were executed, but only after legal proceedings. The women, however, were punished immediately, publicly, violently. Why? Because their crime was not political. It was sexual. In the eyes of their communities, these women had committed the ultimate betrayal, not against the state, but against French masculinity. During the occupation, French men had been humiliated. They had been defeated in battle. They had been unable to protect their country, their families, their women. They had lived under foreign control for 4 years. And during that time, some French women had formed relationships with the occupiers, the men who had defeated them. This was unbearable. So when liberation came, the women became scapegoats. Punishing them was a way for French men to reclaim their power, to reassert their control, to punish the humiliation they had felt. The shaving of the women's heads was symbolic. Hair is associated with femininity, with beauty, with sexuality. By cutting it off, the community was saying, "You are no longer a woman. You are no longer one of us." It was a ritual of exclusion, of dehumanization, and it was gendered violence carried out in the name of patriotism. Asterisk. Let us return to Simone. After that day in August 1944, her life changed forever. The photograph taken by Robert Capa was published around the world. It appeared in Life magazine. It was printed in newspapers across Europe and America. It became one of the most iconic images of the liberation. But for Simone, there was no fame, only shame. She returned to her home in Chartres, but she was no longer welcome. Neighbors turned away. Shops refused to serve her. Children were told not to play with her daughter. She lived in isolation. She rarely left her house. She spoke to almost no one. Her daughter grew up knowing that she was different, that her existence was proof of her mother's crime, that she carried the weight of a war she had nothing to do with. Simone never spoke publicly about what happened. She never gave interviews. She never defended herself. She lived quietly, in pain, for 22 more years. In 1966, at the age of 44, Simone Touseau died. The cause of death is not widely recorded, but those who knew her said she had never recovered from that day in the square, that the humiliation, the rejection, the loneliness, it had broken something inside her that could never be repaired. Her daughter survived, but she, too, carried the burden of her mother's punishment. She grew up in a country that had marked her as the child of the enemy, and the photograph, the one that captured her mother's suffering, remained in history books, in museums, in documentaries, but Simone's name was rarely mentioned. Her story was rarely told. She became a symbol, but she was forgotten as a person. Asterisk. For decades after the war, France did not want to talk about the women who were punished. The narrative of liberation was heroic. It was about resistance fighters, brave soldiers, the triumph of freedom. It was about General de Gaulle returning to Paris. It was about victory. There was no room in that story for the violence committed by French citizens against French women. So the story was buried. The women who survived rarely spoke. They were ashamed. They were afraid. They had been told by their communities that they deserved what happened to them. And French society agreed. It wasn't until the 1990s 50 years after the war, that historians began seriously examining what had happened. Documentaries were made, books were written. Survivors, now elderly, began to share their stories, and slowly the truth emerged. This was not justice. This was mob violence. This was gendered revenge disguised as patriotism. Some of the women punished were guilty of real collaboration, but most were not. Most were simply women who had relationships with German soldiers, relationships that may have been complicated, difficult, even coerced, but were not acts of treason. And their children, the children born from these relationships, were innocent, yet they too were punished, rejected, ostracized. France has never officially apologized. There has been no monument, no memorial, no recognition. The women remain, even now, in the shadows of history. France was not alone. Across Europe, in every country liberated from Nazi occupation, women were punished for relationships with German soldiers. In Norway, approximately 50,000 women were accused of fraternizing with Germans. Many had their heads shaved. Some were imprisoned. Their children, called war children, were taken away, placed in institutions, abused. In the Netherlands, thousands of women were shaved and paraded through the streets. Some were tarred and feathered. Some were imprisoned for years. In Belgium, women were marched through towns, their heads shaved, swastikas painted on their skin. In Italy, women accused of relationships with German or fascist soldiers were beaten, raped, and killed by partisan groups. Even in Denmark, which had a relatively peaceful occupation, women were punished after liberation. Hundreds were shaved and humiliated in public. The pattern was the same. Everywhere, women's bodies became battlegrounds for national shame. And everywhere, the punishment was immediate, public, and violent, while male collaborators were often given trials and legal processes. This was not about justice. It was about control. Perhaps the most tragic victims of this post-war revenge were the children. Children like Simone's daughter. Children born from relationships between local women and German soldiers. They were innocent. They had committed no crime, but they were marked from birth. In Norway, these children were called Tyskbarna, German children. They were bullied, rejected, denied opportunities. Many were placed in mental institutions, even though there was nothing wrong with them. They were simply unwanted. In France, children like Simone's daughter grew up knowing they were different. They were teased. They were excluded. Some were told by their own families that they were shameful. Many of these children never knew their fathers. The German soldiers had left, returned to Germany, or been killed in the war. The children had no way to know where they came from, and their mothers, traumatized, shamed, isolated, often could not provide the love and stability these children needed. Some children were given up for adoption. Some were abandoned. Some grew up in orphanages. It wasn't until the 1990s and 2000s that many of these now elderly war children began searching for their fathers. Some traveled to Germany. Some found records. Some discovered that their fathers had returned home, started new families, and never spoken of the French woman they left behind. These children, now in their 70s and 80s, are still reckoning with the legacy of a war they did not fight. Robert Capa's photograph of Simone Touseau is one of the most published images of World War II. But for decades, no one knew who the woman in the photograph was. She was simply the shaved woman of Chartres, a symbol, an anonymous figure representing the moral complexity of war. It wasn't until the 2000s that researchers definitively identified her as Simone Touseau. And even then, very little was known about her life. Capa himself rarely spoke about the photograph. He was a man who had seen the worst of war, death, destruction, horror. But this image seemed to affect him differently, because it showed something he didn't often capture: the violence of liberation, the cruelty of the victors. Capa was a Jewish Hungarian refugee who had fled fascism. He had every reason to hate the Nazis, but this photograph suggests he understood something deeper, that revenge, even against collaborators, even in the name of justice, carries its own kind of violence. The photograph does not judge Simone, it does not condemn her. It simply shows her vulnerable, human suffering, and in doing so, it asks the viewer a question: what is justice? And who deserves punishment? August 18th, 1944, Chartres, France. Simone Touseau walks through the crowd, holding her daughter, her head shaved, her dignity stripped away. She was not a traitor. She was not a spy. She was a woman who loved the wrong man at the wrong time, and for that, she was punished by the very people she had lived alongside for years. Punished by her neighbors, punished by her countrymen. No trial, no evidence, no chance to defend herself. Just the mob, and the shears, and the camera. 20,000 women, across France, across Europe, punished not for what they did, but for who they loved. History remembers wars. It remembers battles and leaders and heroes, but it often forgets the pain that hides behind victory, the violence that follows liberation, the cruelty that lives inside even the righteous. Simone Touseau died in 1966, at the age of 44. She never recovered from that day in the square. Her daughter lived on, carrying the weight of a photograph she did not choose to be in. And Robert Capa's image remains, a haunting reminder that war does not end when the shooting stops, that justice and revenge are not the same thing, and that sometimes the greatest cruelty comes not from the enemy, but from our own comment. Below, what do you think should have been done differently? Should France apologize? Let's discuss.